Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I thought we would start this event with a prayer to St. Carlo Acutis, who is one of the patrons of the center. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Dear Lord, we ask for the intercession of St. Carlo Acutis, a young witness of the love of Christ from our own century, to help us draw ever closer to your embrace. Help us to keep close to the Eucharist as our focal point amidst distraction, the grounding of our being, and our sustenance along our pilgrimage toward the infinite. Like St. Carlo, help us to grow in holiness in the gaze of Christ from the tabernacle, to offer our gifts at the service of your plan, to love those in need as dear friends, and to offer all joys and sufferings for the work of your church. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. St. Carlo Acutis, St. Scholastica. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel today that's hosted by the Center for Technology and Human Dignity. For those who don't know me, I'm the director, Mariele Courtois, assistant professor in the theology department. This evening, we'll discuss the newest installment of the Dicastery for Culture and Education's AI research group of the Holy See, which is the book Reclaiming Human Agency. One of the goals of the center is to lift up the work of our faculty on technology ethics, and our panel this evening includes a great lineup of natural intelligence from among our faculty. So you have Dr. Jeremy Sienkiewicz, who will respond to Chapter 2 on a theological understanding of human agency from the new book. While teaching at Benedictine for the past 14 years, Dr. Sienkiewicz has met the wild intellectuals who teach here and found himself on a search for the mysterious, abysmal heart of the world. This is the bio he wrote for himself, by the way. More importantly, through raising a family in this postmodern world, his desire for the love that lies hidden at the root of being has taken on communal dimensions, seeking to aid those he himself loves, including his many students, to remove the shackles of ubiquitous consumerism, the technocratic paradigm, and the contemporary association of freedom with libertine hedonism. This, which is identified with Jesus Christ, is the one thing needful. We also have Dr. Nickolas Hein, who will respond to Chapter 6 on de-skilling and algorithmic governance. Nickolas Hein is a professor and chair of the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science. He's designed custom algorithms and administered large-scale computations on supercomputers and Beowulf clusters, investigating on the order of 15 billion related geometric problems using several terahertz years of computational power. This work places his research at the intersection of human mathematical insight and large-scale algorithmic exploration. His training in experimental mathematics emphasized how algorithmic tools shape mathematical practice, as large-scale computation can both illuminate and obscure features of mathematical structures. Informed by this perspective, he encourages open discussion about the ways emerging AI tools can both support and limit learning and expertise. And then we also have Dr. Anthony Crifasi, who will respond to a section that's actually from the first book, Encountering Artificial Intelligence, on understanding the differences between the functioning of an algorithm and on human consciousness. Among the courses that Dr. Crifasi regularly teaches is philosophical psychology, which includes philosophical critiques of artificial intelligence and the phenomenology of Pope St. John Paul II, whose work explicitly examines the anthropology of the self and the lived reality of consciousness. These areas converge on philosophical questions about subjectivity, personhood, and the limits of purely computational or behavioral accounts of human experience, which align closely with discussions about AI, the self, and consciousness. So now you know why we have this great trio up here to talk about AI today. I'll begin our panel with an overview of the goals of the initiatives of the AI research group and some of the important approaches and themes of the two books in this series. Then our panelists will provide their thoughts, responses, and critiques of some of the sections. And then if we have time remaining, we'll also open up to questions from the audience. To begin with an overview of the project, at the end of the last decade, the Vatican wanted to explore some of the concerns related to the development of artificial intelligence, an effort which included the Rome Call for Ethics, for which the Pontifical Academy for Life worked with Microsoft, IBM, and other companies to determine principles to guide AI development. The Dicastery for Culture and Education wanted to extend the analysis beyond principles to consider what insights a deeper Catholic anthropology and moral theology bring to bear about AI. The AI research group for the Vatican Center for Digital Culture formed a group of about 20 scholars for the first book and about a dozen scholars for the second book, including technology ethicists, theologians, and philosophers, many of whom also have technical backgrounds in engineering and computer science. So this is a photo from a 2023 meeting in Rome here. During an in-person meeting in the fall of 2022, Bishop Tai, the secretary for the Dicastery leading the project, decided that it would be beneficial for the group to write a book for not only Catholic readers, but also wider communities to consider what the Catholic tradition can contribute to the analysis of emerging technologies. I was honored to participate as a co-author for the two book projects. As you can imagine, for a project with many authors, there were insightful discussions and many lively debates. The purpose of the book project is not to offer a definitive last word on questions related to AI, but rather to start conversations among professionals, the academy, and families, using this book to point to further resources that can be tapped. This panel today will model this very goal in starting these conversations. The first book, Encountering Artificial Intelligence, considers the major differences between the personhood of a human being, the capacities of the intellect for true encounter, versus the limitations of the abilities of an algorithm. According to theological anthropology, it is impossible to claim that AI is conscious or possesses personhood. The second half of the first book explores applied ethics, which draws from the anthropological analysis to consider ways that AI may or may not be used in light of responsibilities to the dignity of the person, to the virtuous care and development of a society, and to commitment to the common good. The second part of the first book considers specific spheres, from medicine to education to the political sphere to the family, and explores how various ethical commitments can help guide our technological discernment. The Dicastery for Culture and Education and the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith utilize this book as a starting point for the joint note Antiqua et Nova, and you'll notice overlap with the structure, themes, and points between these two documents. The AI Research Group's new book is Reclaiming Human Agency. The second book addresses urgent questions about how technology can affect human actions by subtly impacting social structures, nudging decisions, or even using more conspicuous means, such as the replacement of human workers with AI robots or chatbots. Many of these concerns arise in light of the datification of all areas of human life, but also in the wake of what is called agentic AI, which refers to types of AI that seem to act more like an autonomous agent that completes complex tasks. The expectation for agentic AI is that rather than feeding AI directions for how to complete each step toward a goal, you can instead simply tell the agentic AI your ultimate desire, or perhaps it can even detect it before you ask, such as to create an itinerary for a family vacation, maybe to purchase groceries for the week. You can see the AI robot in the background, style your hair, clean the room while you listen to music, or perhaps read to you while you stare blankly into the distance. So this is the Neo domestic robot that is by 1X Technologies. And if you want one, then you can pay $20,000 to get your own Neo robot. So based on the information that it's gathered about you and about your family, these types of agentic AIs will be able to complete the task on their own and with fewer inputs and back and forths with the user. I'll highlight 4 major themes from our book for considering the relationship between technology and human action, and then our panelists will dive into 3 other particular areas. First, I'll talk about the need to properly understand human agency. Second, the ways that AI can be deployed to short-circuit our decision-making. 3, the effects of rapidification. And 4, the importance of the relationship between the human person and work. Though I'll present what I find to be some of the most important issues, I will describe them and discuss them with our panelists through my own personal perspective as a moral theologian without speaking on behalf of the AI research group as a whole. First, to understand human agency as a divinely given vocational responsibility. One of the tasks in engaging technology ethics is navigating the different assumptions, frameworks, and usage of terms between different disciplines. For example, Russell and Norvig, the authors of one classic textbook on AI, write that, quote, an agent is just something that acts, but computer agents have other attributes, such as operating under autonomous control, perceiving their environment, persisting over a prolonged period of time, adapting to change, and being capable of taking on another's goals. A rational agent is one that acts so as to achieve the best outcome, or when there is uncertainty, the best expected outcome, end quote. This loses grounding in a few important concepts, however, such as the need for agency to perceive reality in truth, rather than just reasoning or acting toward an objective. As the first chapter of the book explains, Aristotelians understand even simply being alive as an act, so all people have agency, even those who lack the exercise of consciousness, rationality, or the ability to act physically in the world. Our focus in this book is on a more particular form of agency, responsible human agency. It is this responsibility that Pope Francis has described as, has explained in his own writings, but he states that, quote, "We would condemn humanity to a future without hope if we took away people's ability to make decisions about themselves and their lives by dooming them to depend on the choices of machines. We need to ensure and safeguard a space for proper human control over the choices made by artificial intelligence programs. Human dignity itself depends on it," end quote. By responsible agency, we mean voluntary action that is freely chosen, informed by reason, and aimed at achieving human goods. Ultimately, it aims at human flourishing, which is achieved through right relationship with God and others. In contrast to the computer science definition of agency, responsible human agency relies on deliberation about reasons and conceptions of the good. Reflection on the good is important because proper human agency cannot be understood in terms of merely libertarian freedom from external constraint or influence. Instead, it is a freedom for pursuing the good, a freedom for excellence. Human agency is given to us so that we might pursue the purpose of the human life. Here I have Caravaggio's painting of the calling of St. Matthew to bring to mind the many examples of true human agency that we find in the saints. While many AI programs are built to function according to interpreted, predictable tendencies of human activity, this offers a reminder of what cannot be calculated, the way grace can move us in surprising, uncharacteristic, yet fully personal ways. Especially from a Thomistic perspective, rationality and free will are important divine gifts to the human person. But these gifts are not ordered toward an imposition of one's will to create the world. These capacities are not fulfilled simply through autonomous choice. Rather, these capacities are ordered to a deeper knowledge of the mind of God embedded in the world and allow the human person to participate in this order of God. This reveals the great characteristic of human life as the reception of a gift, rather than self-creation or passivity. The human person is not meant to simply receive God's goodness and consume it thoughtlessly. The human person is capable of receiving God's goodness and delighting in it. The person can recognize God's gratuity and the necessary role of liturgically offering back the gifts of God for eschatological perfection. The human person is not only able to perceive God's love as a gift, but also to participate within that love through God's invitation to enter into it. Thus, the human's existence depends upon the gift of God, and each individual life narrative becomes a return gift back to God only by cooperating with and inviting the work of God's own grace. Though we gauge and stand amused at the functionalities of artificial intelligence that seem to mimic human agency in its capacity to intake data and to issue a response, true agency, rightfully understood, is something that is uniquely a divine gift to persons. Agency requires an inner life and the ability to not simply respond to a command, but to sense and weigh different values at stake in an action, and to sacrifice some values for the pursuit of others that are considered more important. Thus, humans are capable of directing actions that are revealing of their personhood, or the values that they hold dear within them, through an action that requires both the intellectual capacity to perceive the truth and a capacity of the will that is able to choose the good, thus revealing the honest structure of love within the acting being. It is important for us to protect human agency, not only out of a desire to safeguard the well-being of human persons, but to acknowledge within a full understanding of this well-being the call for the human person to participate in God's own work and God's own existence, which can only come from a free-willed, loved response of the human person to take up this calling for oneself. This is why Catholic moral theology calls for a careful discernment regarding technologies that claim to take up a significant extent of personal human activity. That is, technologies that are directed not simply to help us perfect an activity or allow us to better participate in it ourselves, but rather to eliminate our place in the activity and execute actions on our behalf. Second, I'll now turn to look at agency as nudged and measured. I'll describe some of the ways in which AI technologies can affect human agency by influencing our processes of decision making and accelerating society. First, when human persons outsource decision making to an AI chatbot by asking it for advice, especially for matters considered too personal, embarrassing, or controversial to ask another person, an opportunity is lost to learn from another's lived experience. Some may argue that deferring to a chatbot may avoid the risks of stigma, shame, or resentfulness that could come as a consequence of seeking these answers in the context of a human relationship. This leads to an error of presumption on the part of the questioner that another human cannot show compassion or mercy, and eliminates the opportunity for the potential human interlocutor to respond to the given circumstances, to offer a response to vocation, as the word derived from Latin is vocare, to call, that can benefit the respondent just as much as the questioner in their journey of discernment, humility, and faith. Yet even beyond the relational damages that arise from utilizing AI as a conversation partner, there are even more subtle ways that AI can affect human decision-making, perhaps even without our notice. One of these mechanisms of influencing human behavior is through nudges, which do not completely override human freedom, but rather just tilt the likelihood of an action to a preferred direction. As our book explains, an AI application's access to vast stores of data, inferential ability, and quick testing of different approaches allows for the design and personalization of nudging at scale. This opens the door to what's called surveillance capitalism, in which companies utilize data collected on user choices, preferences, or addictions to leverage the likelihood that the user may purchase a product, bolster political support, or further engagements that benefit the company's interests. In surveillance capitalism, as we utilize the services available to us, the providers in turn receive information about our associations, locations, and tendencies to take advantage of, predict, or manipulate our future activities. When considering the ethics particular to nudging, our book proposes that in situations where there must be an inevitable default choice presented, such as determining an option that will appear first among displayed options. For one example, you can draw an analogy to the food at the entry aisles in a grocery store. These determinations should be made in the interest of best supporting human flourishing and avoiding the most harmful outcomes. Other nudging techniques, such as framing the advantages or disadvantages of divergent choices, impact the ways in which information is interpreted and should avoid deliberate deception. These types of nudging should also strive to promote engagement with, rather than intercept, the advice from trusted interlocutors. A third type of nudge that circumvents intentional deliberation are methods that we criticize as illegitimate in every case. These include cases where a map can route a user past a particular diner at lunchtime, or a social media platform preferentially displays posts or activities by friends to encourage the user to take a similar action, such as purchasing something or making a statement. One of the major concerns with this type of nudging is that it intends to interfere with individual prudential discernment through obfuscating other options available and failing to engage the user through intellectual persuasion. Third, to turn to the phenomenon of agency lost at the speed of life. Another concern for the applications of AI technologies is their contribution to what Pope Francis describes as the rapidification of society. This is the phenomenon in which it seems that in more recent generations, there's a feeling of greater loss for time than previous generations. The various reasons for this sense of time loss include the expectations of productive output that become more demanding the more that we rely on technologies to help us complete tasks and keep pace with competitors. Additionally, technologies add new platforms and accountabilities that we did not have previously, thus invading our free time. The results of rapidification not only include a sense of urgency and insufficiency, but also a lack of opportunity for a slowness and discernment that is needed to remind ourselves of the goods to which we decided to direct our work to begin with. This necessary movement of stepping back for contemplation of even small accomplishments and of an examination of progress can help us to identify problems with methods and goals to identify when a project has strayed from its directed ends or ethical procedures. Social acceleration by the inundation of AI technologies is in direct tension with the Benedictine practice of ora et labora, which calls for a release, a Sabbath from work, in order to offer one's work ultimately to the providence of God, a power beyond the self. Likewise, it interferes with opportunities to bring the intentions that are derived and inspired by one's work to the stillness of prayer. Rest allows for rejuvenation at the service of material needs, but also the stillness at the service of our spiritual needs and commitment to our eternal, immovable call from God to his lasting refuge. With the increased social speed of every generation, the slow work of patient love becomes all the more profound. To the last point, to now consider agency expressed in the dignity of work, our deliberate actions reveal the commitments of our hearts. Ordering our day involves choosing one task or burden over another. We may answer the phone for the concerned client before answering a lingering email. We may leave our desk to breastfeed a child, or we may reach out to a colleague to learn a new perspective. There are many types of seemingly mundane tasks that exhibit human care, achievement, and sacrifice. Every integration of technology involves some type of de-skilling, reskilling, or new skilling in response to the already active technocratic paradigm. Some acknowledge that repetitive assembly line type tasks can already be dehumanizing. The use of robotics to tighten a bolt may not be the worst type of AI application or instance of de-skilling. Yet we can realize that something would be lost in the lack of appreciation for the physical therapy patient who successfully relearns the ability to tighten a bolt and can proudly return to his workshop, even if less precise with his tools than before. Something would be taken for granted if the friendly greeting of a grocery store clerk who is otherwise a stranger is replaced by the automated robot who has no other option than to portray a simulation of patience for you. In considering the role of human action in forming habits and cultivating virtue, even the simplest, most repetitive task can be an opportunity to grow in service to God. Even the smallest, most seemingly insignificant movements, such as opening the door for a stranger or hammering a nail, are ones that were performed by great saints with deep love to seek holiness, and even performed by Christ himself. As St. Teresa of Calcutta was known to have said, "Not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love." The choice that St. Teresa described is one that involves an interpretation and offering of the act that only a person can freely perform, not an AI. Yet when accomplished with the cooperation of the person with grace, this intention behind a small good act can help to sanctify the world. We should not forget the moral value of even the smallest acts that as children we must master to understand the physical laws of the world and the coordination of our bodies, that at other stages of our lives may bring to light our finitude and need for dependence, and that even in their most tedious, monotonous mode can be an invitation to higher moral skills of patience, fortitude, and devotion to goods beyond the self. Our most creative work will ever be the journey of our personal vocations. Our vocations require an agency through the Holy Spirit in which we discover the way we are each uniquely and irreplaceably called to take part in the body of Christ. The greatest threats to agency are ones that prevent us from answering and enacting the particular missions to which we are called by God. We should utilize prudence to avoid allowing inundations from technology to distract from the discernment, discovery, and pursuit of vocation. Christ reveals the determination needed along the path of vocation in his shouldering the full weight of responsible, loving freedom. Acting in the world with agency is our responsibility we carry with us along our own vocational paths, one we must not, cannot offload to machines. True agency acts alongside Christ, the only agent who can truly take up our work for us, through us. Technology can serve as a way to meet people and accompany one another in joys and sufferings, but it should never distract from the pursuit of our ultimate freedom in Christ. Now I'll invite Dr. Sienkiewicz, who will respond to a chapter of the new book that defines human agency and its theological components.
Thank you, Dr. Courtois. If she hasn't convinced you should read this book, then you weren't paying attention. I was given the second chapter to respond to here, human agency as conditioned. And as I started to read the first paragraph, I realized that this group that Dr. Courtois is a part of is finally talking about something that we should really be talking about. So I want to bring out some highlights from this chapter and then have a tiny critique at the end. First, the chapter really, the title of my sort of presentation here that I gave is Freedom in the Midst of Structures of Sin and Structures of Love, because we have to see the good and the bad of how this is all true. The chapter highlights, the first one that I would give is that it's a refreshing tour de force on the constitutive nature of freedom. One of the things that immediately stood out to me was the fact that the working group was not afraid to use contemporary authors. Instead of just quoting Augustine, Aristotle, and Aquinas, we saw great people of today like Charles Taylor, Alistair MacIntyre, Max Weber. I didn't see David L. Schindler, which was a problem, but we can move on from that, okay? Maybe he's later in the book. But it's important that we note some of the things that we've learned in the modern times, given the backdrop that we have. Although the book is on really the age of artificial intelligence, it's interesting how when we encounter problems, we actually are able to look in new ways at our own selves and discover things that we wouldn't be able to discover otherwise. And so this chapter on human agency, which doesn't talk much about artificial intelligence, is obviously sparked by the question of what is human agency because of artificial intelligence. And this meditation on human agency is something I think that could only have come about in this crisis. So I'm going to quote a few things from this second chapter of the book, and just make some comments on them. The very first page 36, says human agency cannot refer to some kind of radical individualism or pure self-assertion, because a person cannot be an agent alone. Here's an understanding of freedom that we're not used to, one that understands that I'm free in the midst of my own environment, in the midst of my own culture, in the midst of my own family, in the midst of my own people. Because true freedom and agency means, as the document says here on page 36, accepting our historical situatedness, recognizing the role of the communities, family, and traditions that have shaped us with gratitude. Okay, so the root of a recognition of the goodness of being, I think, is at the heart of this sort of definition of freedom that corresponds with a union with the rest of the world around us. Rather than seeing freedom as a separation, as like, if I can just get everybody away from me, then I can be free. This book really identifies the fact that freedom is a communal reality, or what I like to call a constitutive reality. Sometimes, although we accept this with gratitude, we need to act well criticizing the times when these traditions and sources do not live up to their own best intuitions or fall away from truth, page 36. We have to recognize that criticizing our own situation is not necessarily not gracious, but in fact is a new way, a unique way, and maybe a required way in every city of man, a way of love. Just because you criticize your situation doesn't mean that you hate your country or your people or something like that. If you see the problem that you encounter in the situation that you find yourself, and you see that it's making you and others unfree in some sense, although it could be making them more free, right? I don't want to say that society always makes you unfree. Then it's a love to bring it, first of all, bring it to light, to illuminate it, because lots of times we're blind to it, which this chapter gets into. I'll talk about that. And second of all, not only to bring it to light, but to bring it to correction, for the sake of the people around me and for the sake of future generations. This understanding of what's happening in our sort of social sphere takes into account the actual nature of freedom as coming from others. Not only originally, as in God gave me freedom when he made me human, or as in, my parents taught me how to, make choices on my own, and now I'm free because I'm away from them. But rather, it sees this freedom as coming from others existentially and ontologically. And the reason this is true is because the actual nature of being is like this, that we are relational beings, to quote page 30. Because we are relational beings, virtuous agency depends in many ways on others, is reflected in our interactions with others, and is demanded in light of the existence of others. Definitely, we are our own persons, but to be a person is to be united with others automatically. And therefore, our freedom, and the more free that we are, has something to do with a gracious union with others. Two of the persons, or I guess categories of persons that the chapter talks about are, first of all, God, who gives us our freedom. We'll talk a little bit about him in a bit, but also other persons who give us our freedom. Both people of the past who have sort of set up the traditions and also the technological tools that we use that enable us to act as human agents today, but also our family, our friends, our coworkers, the people that live in our town. One of the most important things that I think this chapter does is it illuminates the structures of society and how they are a part of what it means to be a human person. One of the things that they point out is that sometimes the structures of society transform us in ways that we don't see. They're hidden. But I want to point out that I think it's doubly occult. First of all, I think that society is hidden as a constitutive part of our freedom. The chapter states, perhaps shockingly to some, and maybe even initially, or perhaps always, depending on the person who reads it, rejected by others, that, quote, social contexts condition our formation as moral agents. We're so used to a liberal and individualistic understanding of freedom, and based in the same kind of metaphysics, that a suggestion that freedom is not pure autonomy, pure autonomous spontaneity, seems contrary to common sense. And we start to think that anything that's going to sort of affect my freedom from the outside is somehow impinging on my freedom, and it sort of makes it impure, and I'm not as free on account of it, which is exactly, I think, what this chapter is rejecting, and rightly so. In fact, it's just this idea of common sense that hides the notion of others in freedom. Okay? We don't even recognize that others are a constitutive part of our freedom. But that's the first thing that it hides, that others are a constitutive part of our freedom. The second thing that it hides is reality itself. The chapter on page 37 identifies this very well. Because the structures in which we are embedded often limit the range of available actions, these structures often distort our ethical perception and limit our recognition of options for action. The chapter says that what seems obvious, possible, and just, those are the three words that are used, which I think are great adjectives to use here. What seems obvious, possible, or just, or what I'll call common sense, are often, unbeknownst to us, not the only options available to us. And it's possible that none of the ways that we think are obvious, possible, and just are truly human ways to act. It's also possible that we are very unaware that this is the case, that the ways that we are given to act are all inhuman ways because of a misunderstanding of what the human person is based in this sort of social construct that we find ourselves in. This leads to what the chapter refers to as a reductionist understanding of the human person, which is, quoting Laudato Si of Francis, dominated by the internal logic of that particular society with its particular distortions in which we find ourselves. We have to recognize that although our freedom is something that comes to us from the outside, from others, as well as from our own spontaneity, there's this sort of coaction that takes place between others and myself in freedom, that it's acted upon because of my own personal traits, but also because of the particularness of my society. Both whether the society is a structure of love, aiding me in virtue all around me, or whether it's a structure of sin, which makes me blind to the own lack of virtue that I may have or may even be aware that I can enact. All of this corresponds in a real way, I think, with the human person. What the human person is as revealed by Jesus Christ when he reveals the Trinity. And I think that it's an important argument to make, maybe better to illuminate to people about what freedom actually is, because I think we all suffer from a false understanding of freedom. Now I'll come to my one small critique. The one critique is this. It's a good critique because it uses their own logic so that they have to fall to it. Okay. um, First, the chapter refers to language as being one of these structures that is constitutive of who we are and how we act. The text holds that, page 36, language is a foundational medium of rational thought and is something each person receives from prior generations. And this is true in such a way that, again, quoting, intellectual and cultural traditions, of which I think language is perhaps maybe the most constitutive of them all. Back to the quote, they set the terms for our thoughts and questions and shape how we perceive reality. A shape, I think, which is made by, as they put it, a long line of people passing down ideas. Okay, you don't just come onto the world as a blank slate. You come into the world as a Midwestern American of the 21st century, and you think that way, right? And don't think, oh no, I'm not free. That's what freedom is, right? To receive this in gratitude. But the fact that language can be the thing that, in a sense, helps us to be free can sometimes also be hidden, both that it is at the root of agency and how it constitutes this agency. But if we know it, as I think we as Catholics do, and we who believe these things that are being said in this chapter do, then we have to be careful to speak carefully. We have to engage in the tradition of English, which has been given to us over time through England and America over history, that gives both the meaning of terms at their root, but also their historical transformation that's taken place up into the time that we are now. And we have to speak in ways that aid others in their own freedom. So, page 30 again. Responsible agency can be enabled by others. This is what I'm advocating for in the way that we speak. And it is brought to perfection through collaborative activity, because the way that we understand freedom and the way that we understand how society affects freedom, I don't know exactly how to put that, it's, as the chapter puts, not purely negative. Just as there are structures of sin, so there can be structures of love, and we must be sure that we have to, in a sense, be that preceding generation who, quoting the chapter, develops the traditions and technologies through which future generations will engage the world. So what does this speaking about language have to do with freedom again? The chapter title, Human Agency as Conditioned, is an important one, and how we understand the word conditioned is super important. If we understand that human agency or human action and freedom is constituted by others, God, then that's the nature of the reality of human freedom and how we should be understanding it. And I think that's really the definition that's given forth in the chapter. But if by conditioned we mean corrupting or making impure in some way, even if we mean for the good, then I'm afraid we're still stuck in a liberal definition of freedom itself. Some of the vocabulary that's used in the chapter, such as boundaries or constraints, imply a prior existence of a libertas pura, some sort of pure freedom, which is then colored by various elements of others. These terms could lend to the fact that others are foreign to the nation of freedom, and thus always, in some sense, distorting it even for the good, right? But we don't want to use what the Second Vatican Council says, wilesome wiles to trick people into like doing the good or something like that. I think these words and the way that these words are used is contrary to the express intent and really the very reason of the chapter that the authors are writing. And therefore, I'm receiving gratitude this chapter. But I do want to just point out that maybe we need to be a little more careful in how we talk. Just as, to quote the chapter again, page 32, we find in God not a rival, but a guarantor and sustainer of human freedom. When we see that divine causality and human agency are not competitive but complementary, that's all quoting from the chapter. So too, we have to see our creation and culture as enabling as well. The difference between God's involvement in my freedom and creation or the culture's involvement in my freedom is that creation and culture are fallen. And thus they enable, they foster to perfection each substance to the happiness that just is the common good. But they also disable and blind human agency in the measure of its glory or fallenness of the culture that you find yourself in. This is manifest in the way that we receive this culture, both in traditions, which we could understand as either liturgy, an enabling thing, or proms, perhaps a disabling thing. and technologies such as the wheel, perhaps enabling, and maybe cars, perhaps disabling, if you read Ivan Illich. So overall, I received this chapter with gratitude, but I want to be careful in the way that we use our language, that we don't fall into the same trap that we're trying to avoid. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Sienkiewicz. Now we'll have Dr. Hein, who will respond to a chapter that considers some of the risks of de-skilling and algorithmic governance, which involves using data to direct the choices of community members.
Thank you, Dr. Courtois. Oh. Thank you, Dr. Courtois, for inviting me. I'm excited to share in this conversation. So, is this picking me up? The sound system's set up so well that I'm not hearing myself through the speakers, so I guess that's a good thing. So the title is Lost Opportunity of the chapter 6. It's Lost Opportunities for Agency Through De-Skilling and Algorithmic Governance. But before I start to go through some points and address them specifically, I want to give you some other, things that the title could have been, so that you think about those things as we go through. So one thing we could have called this is Lost Opportunities for Agency Through De-Virtuing and Algorithmic Governance. We'll see how that fits as a possibility. And maybe another nice title for this chapter would have been The Pros and Cons of Algorithmic Governance, especially when it comes to de-skilling. So there's also a theme of, I think maybe you could call it reskilling, or maybe just skilling, that as we lose some skills because computers are doing some things for us, or algorithms are doing some things for us, we have to acquire other skills. And there's a question of which skills are better for us as humans to have. So I'll get to that also. But I'm going to kind of go through in order, and I'll read some little bits here and share some thoughts on those points. So I didn't highlight anything. So I kind of did this. This is my way to prevent myself from being tempted to have ChatGPT write my notes. I just sort of highlight, write in the margins. I'm like, it can't do that, so that's what I'm going to do. Just took a stand. So anyway, so one major theme, I didn't highlight anything on the front because it's all good, right? What do you highlight? Just color in the whole thing. But the general idea opening up is that governments or any kind of governing agency could use algorithmic governance, and then that means that we're making less choices, and so we might lose the skills that we would practice by having those choices. But we also lose our voice, and those are both bad things, and we want to see whether any good things that come from using these tools can outweigh those bad things, or is this just bad? And not to be pessimistic, if they do outweigh those things, the question is this good, right? So here's one point that I want to think about. Or, by relieving us of the burden of learning and practicing some irrelevant skill, is this yet another way that technology makes our lives better? So, leading up to this, there's a point made that some skills that we had long ago, 1,000 years ago, you might have known how to make a fire with flint and steel, for example. It's not a necessary skill. It doesn't make your life better. And when you lose that skill, you may pick something else up. And so that's a question that's worth asking. And I don't have a lot of comments on that, except that my first exposure, I would say, to not having to have a skill that people who came immediately before me did have to have would be with the kind of search bar abilities that would be built into something like Google. So those of you who are, I did the math, and those of you who are juniors in the room right now, ChatGPT is the same age right now that Google was when I was your age, right? So when I went to college, we started using Google, and the question was, how do you use this, and what skills is that replacing? It was replacing the skill of having to look up information. It was already, it wasn't as good as it is now, but it was already very good at getting you to information quickly. And so that skill of having to find the information, I didn't need that as much as people who were 5 years older than me in college. I still had to be able to parse the information and use the information. I would make the case that I even used some AI technically in the 90s in college, because I used a program called Wolfram Alpha, and you could conversationally type in the question that you had, and it would have to use a little bit of language processing, which is AI, to figure out what you were actually asking, and then to figure out which algorithm to use. And then it would shift into not AI. It was just algorithmically solving problems. So this has been around for a long time, but there's a lot more awareness around it now with ChatGPT. Okay, jumping to another point. It often seems as though we are living through an endless trial and error process of discovering whether a particular technology has been harmful for us. I wanted to mention that point because um, it's really important. That's a major theme in a book that I read and appreciated by Jordan Peterson called 12 Rules for Life. And he makes this point that that a lot of what is good in society and what passes down by tradition, what's preserved by people who take a more conservative approach to how society should behave, those things get collected over a long period of time. It can take millennia to figure out, exactly what the best way to share meat is if you all kill a woolly mammoth, for example. And these kinds of things get embedded in ritual and mythology. He makes the point that they even get embedded into religion. And of course, that makes me a little uncomfortable when people talk about religion that way, but I think that it's a good point that anything we build into our culture over a really long period of time, it's put together very organically, and we have to respect that. Now, it doesn't mean we can't change it, but we have to respect that and think about that. And moving on, we are privileged. So quoting again, we are privileged. We are in a privileged position to judge the value of what is endangered by some aspects of AI-driven deskilling. And so that is one more point I want to just point out. That's a really good observation, that we're standing at a time here because AI is exploded a little bit in the last few years. There was some AI before, but now there's a lot that it can do that it couldn't do before. And so all of us remember life before that, and now we see life now, and we ask, are there any things that are fundamentally changing? And maybe the answer is no. Maybe this thing isn't doing as much as some people think it will, or maybe it's doing more. But we're in a position to really gauge what's lost. Whereas my youngest children, my oldest children are 12 and 10. I feel like they're also with us in the room, where they experience life one way first. My youngest children, my twins, are 6. They're going to grow up in a world where AI can do a lot of things I don't want to do. So it's worth considering. But at the same time, it's also worth considering this point right here. Juxtaposing that we're in a special time where we're in a position to decide what's good, what's bad, what's keep, what not to do. Quoting, Socrates makes the case that the written word is not an ideal way to communicate truth, right? So Socrates at one time was railing against writing things down. And that's given in this chapter as an example of how hard it is to tell. And in the moment when you're thinking about adopting some new technology, it's so hard to actually tell whether it's good or bad, or how good it is or how bad it is, because I don't expect everyone to have to agree with me, but I'm just going to come out and say what the author said. I agree with it. Socrates got that one wrong. And Socrates is really smart, so I think that says something about how hard it is to judge. That's the point of the authors. It's very hard to judge in the moment what's good and what's bad, and so this has to be built up organically to some extent. So, but also as a math professor, I'll encourage you not to say, well, Socrates was wrong about adopting writing, and therefore we're wrong if we say don't adopt more algorithmic governance, because that would be the converse error, right? That's A implies B does not mean B implies A. Anyway, going on. This example, this is the point. This example therefore only emphasizes how difficult it is to predict whether deskilling will turn out to be a positive or negative. And of course, there's more points here about the de-skilling that's happening as we use more algorithmic decision making. There's trade-offs that as you lose some skills, you might have to practice others. Okay. Not pertinent to any particular quote on this part of the chapter, but just the general sense of what's going on. I would say that I would expect other great minds that were at the time or before Socrates would not have agreed that writing is a bad thing. For example, Euclid. I'm sure he was a huge fan of writing. How carefully he knew his ideas had to be technically fit together. I'm sure he was a fan of writing, for example. Much more recently, there's a well-known philosopher, Simone Weil, that makes some really good points about skills and the importance of skills. And I'll probably mention her again before I sit down today. But she connects in one of her writings, she connects geometry and skill building with being able to grow in capacity for attention, which she says is important for prayer life. And what could be more important than that, essentially? Moving on, there's this other point. AI threatens to displace higher order cognitive skills or cognitive skills that have moral salience or moral skills, which may be properly called virtues. So, de-skilling could be thought of in this context as de-virtuing. You're losing a strength. And that point I made about Simone Weil, I think, is a good connection between when losing a skill means that you're losing something that you might traditionally call a virtue. Because if you truly do lose the ability to maintain attention, real attention, how can you even pray and when you're done know that you prayed? Like I can move my lips, and then 5 minutes later I can forget that I did that, or I can even think through the words more carefully in my mind and not move my lips, and 10 minutes later forget if I did that even. So I think that is a serious thing to consider, that if we are using, and now a lot of this is in the context of algorithmic governance, but it's also in the context of just using algorithmic tools, especially using AI tools. Using those tools can cost you some brain exercise, and if you're not getting other better brain exercise for it, you could be coming out behind there. So that's really important. Now there are a couple of paragraphs that talk about a really great example of autopilots as a way to think about good and bad, and maybe just the spectrum in between when it comes to using something algorithmic to make a job easier. So what we usually think of when we talk about autopilot is, I'm not a pilot, so I don't know how it works, but I'm sitting in a cockpit, and I guess maybe I just punch a button and I get to lean back and I get to watch the movie, and the plane just flies itself. It's probably not quite that luxurious, but I think I can take my hand off the wheel. I think at least that's part of what autopilots do. And this has some advantages and it has some disadvantages. One advantage is that autopilots might be safer than human pilots in some contexts. And one disadvantage is that they might not be as safe as human pilots in some contexts. Those are the two obvious ones. But then the less obvious ones, which are discussed in this chapter and are important points, are that if pilots use autopilots all the time, then they start to lose the skill of piloting. And then if human intervention is needed and you have poor skills, then you could be in trouble. And another point here is made that that most of the most complicated parts of flying are still done by humans, takeoff and landing. I don't know that much about that kind of autopilot, so I can't speak to that, but I do think that that's an interesting point, that the aviation industry appears to have taken a stand to try to keep their pilots well skilled, and I think that's thoughtful. I couldn't decide whether to mention this or not because it's only tangentially related. It has to do with the derivative, so it really is tangentially related. But just as a part of, I try not to brag unless it's about my mother or my father or God. That's in the commandments, right? So my Dad has a couple of patents for autopilots, so I'll talk about that one. So one of his autopilots that he invented that Learjet used is based on controlling the pitch of a plane. And so the point is, if a plane is flying and it pitches down too far, then the wings, they block the wind to the tail, and the tail has the thing that controls the pitch. And if you block the wind to the tail, you actually can't control the pitch anymore. And then the plane just falls and you die, right? And so there were autopilots in place that were set to take over if the pilot hit a certain angle. And the improvement, the reason I know this is I asked him, I teach calculus, so I was like, Dad, you got to give me a real world application. How can you use the derivative? And he said, well, here's what we did. Instead of just taking the angle as a cutoff, why don't you instead take the data of what the angle is and what the rate of change of the angle is, because that's all in the computer. You have a numerical derivative. You can plug it all in. And then instead of asking when you're this many degrees away from danger, have it take over when you're so many seconds away from danger. And so then it actually permits the pilot to have control more often, and at the same time makes the plane safer. And so I wanted to give that example because I love that example, but also because I think that's an example of when algorithmic implementation that could take skills away. I would say using it as a moral good, because the goal is to save the lives of the people that are on the plane, and it's only partially de-skilling. It actually lets the pilot fly more, right? So there's that. And these points of, and by the way, these points of moral good and saving lives are in the chapter, so that's not me being clever. That was already in there, by the way. So you should read this book. Another point in this part of the chapter has to do with ways that you can kind of be maybe intellectually lazy a little bit. And one thing that's related to that is, while rudeness might indicate malice, it also might merely indicate poor formation. And in that case, it is more of an unformed capacity than a deformed capacity. And so this talks about maybe intellectual laziness isn't right. Maybe this is maybe it's better to say this is about when you don't have a skill formed yet, and when forming a skill is important in a social context. And I wanted to highlight that and read that because I wanted you to be thinking about how unpleasant it is to be around rude people. And I want you to think about how if it's unintentional, those people might really be struggling to not be rude. So if I'm ever rude to you, just believe me that I'm just really bad at not being rude. And I'll come back to that later when I get to another part of the chapter. I'm trying to respect the order the ideas are presented. So another point that's made here is that there was a job at one time called computer. A computer used to be a person who calculated difficult things, and that job doesn't exist because we've invented electronic computers, calculators that can do those things. And when that happened, of course, the people who had those jobs, then they couldn't keep those jobs anymore. Those people weren't needed to do those things. They had to find other things to do. And that is something that should be thought about if we're thinking about adopting technology right now of various forms, that there are people who do things that won't be able to do those things anymore. And that doesn't mean that the tool is a bad tool. I think generally, as a math professor, I'm going to say calculators are a good thing in general. Like, I'm glad they exist. And but they do have the ability to de-skill people. And so here's a point worth noting. The ability to perform mental math seems to be beneficial to the mind. So there are studies on that, and just because we can have technology do math for us doesn't mean that's what we should do, because then we have trouble building on those mathematical skills if they're not really ours. If I had an app on my phone that would read for me, like I pointed at a page and it would read it out loud for me, then I guess I never need to learn what sounds the letters make, right? That's kind of preposterous, isn't it? You should still be able to read. So the calculator mental math example is kind of like the number sense version of that. Okay, so on that topic of mental math being good for us, I wanted to come back to Simone Weil and just say that that was one of her main points in a letter that she wrote to Father Nickolas Hein, who ran a boarding school for boys. And in this letter, she wrote how, you shouldn't have a favorite subject. You should give full attention to all your subjects. You should really care about all of them. And then she goes, this is where she gives those examples about geometry I was mentioning earlier. So she picks one, she picks geometry and says, here's what it looks like when you're working with a really difficult problem in geometry. You have to really think about things. You can't make big leaps in your thinking without justification. It forces you to slow down. You can't just be there with your muscles tense and your eyes open. Like I'm sure that when I was an undergraduate student, I did this a lot. I sat in the chair in my class and my eyes were wide open and I was making sure that I was sitting up straight and I didn't understand what was going on, but my teacher knew I was there, right? And that doesn't work for solving a geometry problem. You can't stare at it and satisfy it. It doesn't work. And so she makes this point that, that you, by having to solve a problem and give it real attention, you you build up this capacity in you. And she connects that to prayer, which I think is really important. Although she does say well, yeah, anyway, I'll stick to this chapter. This is what I want to talk about. Yeah. Going on. But more than that, we might think of what technical skills Jesus did not develop, most of them. That's a really good point. I've been thinking about that the last few years, just seeing what AI can do now. What I don't have to do that anymore. That's great. I hated that thing, whatever it is. Here, I'll give you one. So it's a concrete example. So when I write exams, I write really thoughtful math problems. And then I give them to ChatGPT and I say, give me the distractors. And so it gives me a right answer and it gives me 4 wrong answers that all follow from making a reasonable mistake. And I'm like, that's it. So all I have to do is check that the right answer's on there and I can use it, right? And this may be de-skilling, but I'm okay with losing that skill, the skill of being really good at doing the same computation 5 times with 4 different deliberate mistakes. I'm totally fine with losing that skill. So but I've been thinking about specifically, how does this fit in with our model for perfecting virtue, which is Jesus? There would have been so many skills he didn't have. The Bible doesn't talk about Jesus being good at everything, right? That would be mentioned if he was just amazing at everything that he did. Now, he would be if that's what he wanted to put his attention to, but he didn't. And I think that can be used as an argument in favor of trying to use AI more in order to get things done and not worry so much about some skills you might lose. But I think it can simultaneously be used as an argument against using AI, because one reason that you might use it in decision making is that you might want to make it easier and faster and more efficient. He clearly wasn't worried about optimizing his earthly actions. Is that a fair statement? And so I think that I sort of froze myself on that one. I can't decide whether trying to think about how Jesus would have built skills. I really couldn't decide whether that was a case for or against adopting new technologies, and maybe that's fitting. But it's worth thought. Okay. So moving on, but we can develop practical guidance about. Am I going way too long? Yeah, I'm so sorry. There's a lot in here that I'm very excited about, but I actually got to most of the main points that I wanted to make, which is in most of the first half of the chapter. The chapter, I'm just going to say it shifts gears and it talks about how we should be thinking about different skills. There are some skills that maybe we don't need to worry about having AI involved, and some skills in which maybe we need to be more cautious, and then there certainly are some skills where we always have to be involved. And an example would be like triaging sick people. If you can only take care of some of them, then you want to make sure that you pick the right ones, and a human should do that. And then there's some things in here about how using AI and algorithmic governance can kind of make it opaque what's going on. It can hide the decision making process, and then it can make it harder for people to fight against unfair decisions. And that's a really important point as well. And then another point that I can't not mention it, is that some people would push algorithmic decision making to try to eliminate bias, but there have been situations where it's been seen that in fact it's called junk in, junk out, that if your data had bias cooked into it, then the decisions that come out of the algorithm have the same biases. So you shouldn't pretend that AI is any more objective than humans, because it learns from humans. And those are all the main points I wanted to make. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hein. And now we have Dr. Crifasi, who will respond to a chapter from the first book that's investigating the differences between algorithmic function and human consciousness.
Okay. All right, I'll make this quick. So the essay I'm commenting on is titled A Sine Qua Non of Relationality and Intelligence. The essay argues that evaluating artificial intelligence requires a clear account of consciousness as subjective first-person experience. Personal experience is essential for understanding, love, and authentic human life. Reducing persons to functional systems or problem solvers ignores this experiential dimension. So the decisive question for AI is whether it can possess consciousness, which is a philosophical question. So following the philosopher John Searle, American philosopher who taught at UC Berkeley, consciousness is qualitative and subjective. Although that's obvious in lived experience, philosophers and scientists often avoid trying to explain it in terms of behavior, cognition, or mechanisms. This makes machine consciousness seem plausible. If mental life is reducible to function, then machines that replicate those functions may appear conscious without addressing subjective experience itself. So the essay argues that such an explanation stems from a mechanistic view of reality that treats material existence as fully explicable in physical terms. So any serious discussion of machine consciousness has to question the assumption that physical causality exhausts reality. So a central issue is whether behavior is sufficient evidence of consciousness. This is the philosophy called behaviorism. So using the famous Turing test, if a machine can exactly duplicate human responses to the same stimuli, then the same mental states attributed to the human must also be attributed to the machine. So if we infer consciousness in humans from that behavior, we cannot deny it in machines that exhibit the same behavior in response to the same stimuli. Some philosophers use this reasoning to support the possibility of machine consciousness. The essay responds that this confuses epistemology, or how we know minds, with ontology, or what minds actually are. Okay. The debate becomes ethically significant in discussions of friendship with AI. The Irish philosopher John Danaher argues that authentic friendship depends on mutual goodwill, shared values, and honesty, but those all can be assessed behaviorally, he says. Robots could therefore qualify as friends, according to him, if they reliably perform these behaviors. The essay criticizes this as ethical behaviorism, which is accurate, which reduces friendship to predictable performance. Genuine friendship requires a correspondence between interior states and outward actions, and a robot that mirrors one's desires creates an echo chamber rather than a relationship of mutual growth. This is my description of what the essay is saying. Okay? Biology also plays an important role in the essay. It says shared human biology gives us reasonable grounds for assuming similar interior experiences behind similar behavior. This link is absent in machines. If biology is dismissed, then behavior alone becomes the standard for authenticity, and then machines can think, et cetera, right? So the essay then cites the Canadian cognitive scientist Stephen Harnad as a proponent of what's called an epiphenomenal account of consciousness. Harnad maintains that consciousness is real, but has no causal power. All behavior is determined by physical processes in you and from the world. Consciousness is a subjective byproduct of certain objective physical systems in you, and possibly also, according to him, in robots. So consciousness, according to him, cannot be empirically detected because it is a subjective effect. Okay? This view preserves the consistency of physical causality in the universe. These are materialists. Right? Everything is explained in terms of physical causes, including consciousness, but consciousness has no causal effect on anything in the physical universe, including your own body. So free will is illusory, according to him. The essay argues that if consciousness has no causal role, then human empathy and self-gift all become illusory, since only physical causes would matter. Okay, the American philosopher Daniel Dennett, next cited in the article, this is all from the article, it's in my description, right? Goes further by treating talk of beliefs and subjectivity as predictive shorthand for behavior. Empathy just becomes behavior prediction. The essay rejects this as incapable of accounting for the depths of human relationships, which presupposes genuine interior lives. The essay criticizes functional theories such as global workspace models as for committing and, quote, an intermediate level fallacy. And that means these theories focus on correlations between brain states and functions while redefining consciousness to fit physical explanations rather than confronting subjective firsthand experience. Right? So in response, the essay calls for a richer account of consciousness that recognizes its relational, unified, and intersubjective nature. Phenomenology, as a philosophy, is helpful, it says, because it begins from lived experience. Consciousness is always intentional or about something. I'll come back to that. Embedded in a meaningful world and inseparable from embodiment. Okay. It is also fundamentally intersubjective. One's awareness of others and reality arises through empathy and shared experience. Drawing on the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, the text emphasizes the, quote, face-to-face encounter as foundational for selfhood and ethical responsibility. Okay, the essay then applies this to a Christian anthropology. Human consciousness is understood as relational and grounded in participation in the life of the triune God. Through grace, humans are invited into a communion of self-gift that mirrors divine love. Consciousness includes both bodily and spiritual dimensions that allows perception of meaning and value. This is all from the article still. Grace perfects human nature, enabling authentic love and self-gift. Human flourishing involves recognizing oneself as loved by God and responding in love to others. So consciousness is inseparable from ethical responsibility and communion, according to this is the solution proposed by the article. The ultimate purpose of human existence is participation in divine life. Right? So within this framework, human persons are uniquely structured for mutual love and sincere self-gift. Relationships are not just behavioral changes, but encounters between conscious subjects capable of empathy and shared meaning. This is deepened in Christian life through union with Christ and the transformative work of grace, which allows individuals to perceive Christ in others and respond to suffering with love. Right, so that's the article. That's pretty much the summary of the article, the whole reasoning of the article, right? All right, now I'd like to comment on this by proposing, my only comment really, the critique of the modernists is not bad at all. I mean, it's perfectly fine, the philosophical critiques of the philosophers that I went through. I do want to propose, though, an alternative solution to the article's solution. And specifically to this part of the essay that I'm about to quote. Right, so listen to this part of the essay. Consciousness, quote, consciousness is always consciousness of something. This is what phenomenology refers to as intentionality. We are never merely conscious, but are always conscious of this book or of that pen. To be conscious is always already to be conscious of something. Moreover, intentionality requires a subject or an I who is conscious. Consciousness is never mere consciousness. I am always conscious, and I am always conscious of something. Intentionality thus demonstrates how consciousness is inherently relational and subjective. And the essay goes on to argue that it's that inherently relational nature of consciousness that then justifies genuine relation with other human beings. Right? So, in his book, Person and Act, Pope St. John Paul II expressly denies this. He denies that consciousness is intentional, meaning that consciousness is always consciousness of something. He says the reason is that this would, by definition, make consciousness objective not subjective. If consciousness is inherently intentional, and intentionality is always of some object, then you can only be conscious of objects, not the subject anymore. And the whole point of consciousness is it's the subject. The subject is what observes, not what is observed. If the subject were an observed object, it would by definition not be a subject. So he says that it's the cognitive acts that are intentional, not consciousness. So, for example, the senses, he says, and the understanding are intentional because you never just sense or understand. You're always sensing something, you're always understanding something, just like the article said. Right? You cognize objects. So, cognition is intentional. That just means the senses understanding. Okay. What consciousness does, he says, is it makes those sensations and understanding yours. So when humans, for example, see red, that's not just experiencing red. It's experiencing that I'm seeing red, the I part. Okay. So an inherent part of the experience is my subjectivity, not just the object that I'm seeing. In other words, consciousness subjectifies objective cognitions by making my experiences of objects my experiences. So it's cognitions like sensation and knowledge that are intentional or objective, not consciousness, he says. Pope St. John Paul II says this is necessary in order to avoid turning the subject into an object like any other object, which would immediately destroy its inherent subjectivity. This would mean that consciousness is not foundationally relational. Consciousness is first and foremost individual, because its first and foremost job, he says, is to make experience your experience and only your experience. That's foundationally, he says, what it does. Pope St. Paul II argues that all human relations phenomenologically presuppose that primordial subjectivity that is yours and yours alone. That solution preserves the subjective nature of consciousness in a way that doesn't compromise the foundationally individual nature of your consciousness. And I would offer that as an alternative solution. I'm running short on time, so what I was going to read is apart from one of his, not his encyclicals, one of his letters as Pope, where he specifically says that all talk, every bit of structural sin, social sin, must be completely 100% reducible to personal sin. He says to do otherwise would be to destroy human agency. And he emphasizes that very strongly. Yep, that's what I'm saying.
Thanks so much, everybody, for coming, and thank you so much for our panelists for your wonderful comments and critiques. So if we could give all of our panelists a round of a hand.